If I asked you to get a piece of paper and something to write with, and to make a numerical list of all the things that you would be willing to die for, how long is your list?
Panther 48.
Willing to die for.
Panther 48.
Willing to die for. How long is your list?
What is the tribal self?
Panther
The
48.
tribal self is what goes above the immediate acquaintances of the social.
Willing to die
The
for.
family, the people you know, live next door.
You would be willing
I'm
to
talking about
die for.
tribal self.
Panther 48.
I'm talking about those movies, those yes unheard.
People, everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. For those that are new to Black Panther Party political education, we do this on Thursdays. We're gonna pretty soon be starting this in person. But what we're doing is political education and any information that we can get out to the public to help them fight oppression. With that being said, I want to turn it over to Burrell to give us a class here dealing with police surveillance technology. Help all the people.
All power to the people. Thanks for having me, everyone. And I'm glad that this is still happening on Zoom because I'm actually based on the East Coast. So I wouldn't be able to join you in person, but I'm very, very happy to be able to join you today. I'm going to go over today some different types of surveillance technologies that we know that police officers use, that we know that they use in particular in the San Diego area. And I hope as I am going over some of these technologies that you all feel comfortable dropping your questions in the chat. Comrade Robert is going to be monitoring the chat, and I can just jump in if there's anything that is sort of relevant, and I'll try to get to all of the questions in the next hour plus that we're together. So I am a senior investigative researcher at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I help to organize a project we have called the Atlas of Surveillance. For those of you who aren't familiar with EFF, we are a nonprofit organization. We have been around since 1990. We're based in San Francisco, and our mission is to work toward a world where technology and the digital world is enhancing our civil liberties and freedoms and is not being used to oppress people in a whole variety of ways. We have a team of lawyers, technologists, activists, and investigators like myself who deal with things ranging from police surveillance, which is my area of expertise, to net neutrality, to copyright, all sorts of things affecting the digital world. But what we're going to be talking about today is what we refer to as street level surveillance. And so these are a lot of the different tools that are used by governments and law enforcement agencies to surveil us as we are on the streets, just minding our own business. And this can include things like drones and license plate readers. It ends up being funneled into things called real-time crime centers and fusion centers. And I'm going to touch on a lot of these, but I will also share at the end some links to some more resources so you can dig a bit deeper into some of what these technologies are and what they do and why we think that they are incredibly invasive and need to be heavily regulated, if not totally banned. The project that I referred to earlier, the Atlas of Surveillance, is a project that EFF started alongside the University of Nevada, Reno. And in part, we started it because we were fielding a lot of questions from journalists and researchers and activists about the sorts of technologies that different police departments use, and also the different technologies that their particular police departments used. And people were surprised that there wasn't just sort of a one-stop shop to have these questions answered, although I'm sure most of you can understand that law enforcement isn't necessarily trying to make it easy for us to understand what technologies they are using, and they generally do want to have surveillance and the technologies that they're using feel a bit overwhelming, and seem like the sort of thing that people can't be pushing back against. Um, the Atlas of Surveillance as a project sort of had two particular goals. One was obviously to create the searchable inventory of law enforcement surveillance tools, but also we wanted to break down some of that overwhelming feeling that people can have when they are encountering surveillance tools. And we wanted to be able to collaborate and share this information with as many people as we possibly could, because law enforcement surveillance isn't always secret. It is sometimes mentioned online in various places, in news articles, in vendor materials, and procurement records, social media, and it hasn't really been aggregated in a way that people can look at it. So we do a lot of crowdsourcing, and if you are inspired to contribute to the Atlas of Surveillance, I encourage you to reach out, because we do have a pretty streamlined system for adding to the atlas in a pretty low with a pretty low barrier to entry. We ingest a lot of existing data sets that come from academic sources or journalists or other places where, the people might not be able to easily access them, but that work has already been done. And then we file a lot of public records requests. I file a ton of public records requests. So right now in the Atlas altogether, we have, coming up on 12,000 data points. We cover about a dozen technologies. We only cover about 5,500 different law enforcement agencies. There are about 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country. And so we're doing the best that we can to get as many things in the Atlas as we know about or hear about. It is the largest, most comprehensive database of its type, but it is far from being completely comprehensive. When you go to atlasofsurveillance.org, which is where this resource lives, you can search the database by location, by technology. You can sort of see it visualized with this map. Here are some of the entries that come up for San Diego, and they cover all of the entries that we have that mention San Diego. So some of these are going to be for San Diego County agencies, some of these are going to be for universities, and some are going to be specifically related to San Diego or to some of the surrounding jurisdictions. And some of the reasons that we do this work is because we feel it is very much in the public interest. It is a violation of a lot of our freedoms, our privacies, our right to a fair and equal justice system to have this sort of surveillance being foisted upon people who live here. There are huge security risks associated with some of the surveillance and some of the data collection that goes on. There's a lot of waste that happens. There's fraud that happens. Law enforcement abuse these databases. And we are strong advocates for government transparency. And we're really always sort of trying to push for transparency around the ways that law enforcement use these tools, spend our money, and interact with our communities. So we think that all of these things are incredibly important, and that is why we need to be keeping track of what surveillance tools are being purchased. I assume some of you can think of some problems with surveillance, but I just want to go over some of the ones that we think about and talk about a lot. Obviously, mass surveillance is a problem. It's collecting information on you, whether or not you've committed a crime. There are lots of errors that can happen in a lot of this surveillance technology. There are disproportionate impacts on neighborhoods, on businesses, and often there is a racial impact on people, and often primarily socioeconomic and racial disparity in how these surveillance technologies are being applied. We see a lot of mission drift when these technologies are adopted, when they are being justified in their procurement by the threat of terrorism or really violent crimes. And then we see the use drift to other misdemeanor situations or situations in which people are just practicing their First Amendment rights of protest, association, or news gathering. And so we really insist that communities keep track of where these surveillance technologies are being adopted and used and how that's developing, because unfortunately we see communities who feel compelled by, heartbreaking stories of violent crime, and then they're subjected to surveillance that doesn't really have a strong accountability mechanism and gets applied in a lot of other ways. We also see a lot of law enforcement priorities get skewed by the use of surveillance. Obviously, there are chilling effects when you know that you're being watched by the police. And I hope by the end of this conversation, you do not feel chilled by what you have learned here, but instead you feel motivated to engage with some of these acquisitions and find ways to engage your communities also. Obviously, there's a lot of secrecy and misuse, waste, that comes with surveillance technologies. There are these huge cybersecurity concerns, again, with having just this much information on individuals. And we also see a strong profit motive that leads policing to be driven by these sort of sales relationships rather than community needs. And one of the biggest problems, I don't know if it is the biggest problem, but it is a, maybe the biggest problem, is that surveillance is not often about public safety, even though that's how it gets sold to us. It's not necessarily about solving crimes. It's about control. And mass data collection, combined with some of the analytical software tools, will be used to control people, to influence them, to manipulate society. We see a lot of this, and I don't have to explain this to all of you. So I think, though, what I want to impart in part is that surveillance affects everyone. And I think we encounter a lot of people who are under the impression that if they are not breaking the law, then they do not need to be concerned with mass surveillance, or with the fact that a lot of their information is being siphoned up, or that their trips to the grocery store are being clocked by license plate readers. But it does actually affect all of us. And it will be very unfortunate when people find out that it affects all of us only when something goes horribly wrong. And I just really sort of want to underline what I was saying about how some of these acquisitions are really driven by sales relationships, before getting into the technology, because I think that this is a part of the equation that sometimes communities miss, is they don't realize that there are going to be marketing efforts made to law enforcement, even after, say, a community has already turned down a particular technology, or canceled a particular contract, or never bought it at all. There is a strong profit motive. These technology companies often are staffed by ex-law enforcement or ex-military, and they would very much like new customers. And so they work really hard to meet law enforcement officers where they are. This is a scene from the International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference, which is a major conference sponsored by a lot of different technology companies, where police officers from all over the country and all over the world are basically more or less wined and dined by all of these different types of vendors. There are lots of giveaways. Amazon will regularly have a relaxation zone where, they give out free massages. I went to this conference this year, which was hosted in Boston, a little bit closer to where I'm based. And there were, multiple tables at this event that had bars, that had, donuts. They shut down for one night the TD Garden, home of the Celtics, who had very recently just become NBA champions. They shut down TD Garden, and they had ZZ Top and a number of other people come and perform. All of the concessions were free. And they regularly will have sort of other sorts of giveaways and events like this one, which had been hosted by Amazon Ring a few years ago, where Shaquille O'Neal was in attendance and people could get a free Ring camera if they showed that they had gone to this party. I also want to highlight, because y'all are in San Diego and living in the moment we are, that there is a comparable conference for border security where the vendors know there is even more money for them. This guy was the keynote speaker a few years ago. This is Palmer Luckey. He is the founder of the Oculus VR headset, but he has since transitioned into leading this company called Anduril, which sells the government surveillance towers at the border. It's a really big conference and a very good opportunity for these vendors to develop very personal relationships with law enforcement. And so I just really want to highlight that we live in a capitalist state, and it's not always going to be one and done with some of these technologies trying to find their way into city budgets. Okay. So with all of that said, I want to go over some of the technologies that we track in the Atlas and that you are likely to encounter in the world, starting with body-worn cameras. These are cameras that you have probably seen or heard of. They are cameras that became very widespread during the Obama administration because they were seen by both political parties and by police and by advocates as a way of providing some accountability. Law enforcement can now use a lot of that video in ways that it hadn't been intended to be used by using face recognition or automated video analysis. This is a snapshot of what we currently have in the Atlas, but I imagine that we're missing a lot, and there have been multiple states that have sort of mandated that all of their police departments need to have body-worn cameras. I think there's a good conversation to be had about the value of body-worn cameras, because obviously they do capture terrible things that have happened that we wouldn't have been able to learn about had they not been captured that way. But I think it's also important to know that obviously law enforcement is not going to just let this be an accountability tool. They're very aware that it's also a surveillance tool, and we have absolutely seen law enforcement use body camera footage against activists in order to identify them and later charge them with crimes when they were not committing crimes. I want to mention for San Diego in particular, San Diego has recently passed a surveillance use ordinance. And this is actually this is a good thing because it requires a certain number of steps before law enforcement is able to continue to use the surveillance technology that they already have. And it requires there to be a process before they can get new surveillance technology. This policy now requires that if San Diego Police Department wants to buy something that would be considered surveillance technology, they have to put together a surveillance use report. And that report has to hit a few key elements. It has to talk about why they feel like they need the technology, the policies that they're going to put into place, appropriate uses, ways that they're going to audit the technology, violations that they've found in the past, if there have been any data breaches of the database where that information is going, and a lot of other sort of details. Sometimes they don't go into as much detail as I think they should, but it is at least a first step. In addition to having that policy, there's a privacy advisory board in San Diego, and that surveillance technology use policy has to go to the board There has to be an opportunity for the public to comment on the acquisition of the technology. And once it gets past that board, it then has to go to the city council in order to be approved before they can even open up any solicitations for a new technology. So they can't be taking bids for a new technology that they think that they need until they have already gone through these steps. There is a similar law on the state level related to military equipment, and unfortunately, we see law enforcement circumvent the requirements of that law. And likely, there are going to be instances where some of these steps are also circumvented. But again, at least there's some policy on the books that says there has to be some level of transparency and accountability. I want to highlight, going through some of these reports, they are required currently to go into different neighborhoods. I think it's in like 9 different neighborhoods, and have a public meeting about these technologies and answer questions, and then include those questions and the answers that they gave roughly in these use reports. And going through them, I noticed that they're not very well attended. There were some meetings where there wasn't anybody. And I just want to highlight that if some of these good accountability laws or some of these oversight laws aren't being used by the local community, it's going to motivate law enforcement to try to come back around and get rid of them again, or to ignore some of the requirements, or and so I would just encourage you going forward to consider going to some of these conversations or organizing around some of these conversations, because they are really a good opportunity to put a stop to any acquisitions that are just beyond the pale. So I say all of that because this current slide has some information about how long body-worn camera video must be retained. And retaining the body-worn camera and deleting the body-worn camera in conjunction or in accordance with the retention schedule makes sense. Then that law enforcement needs to keep a certain amount, a certain video for a certain amount of time, and that if they delete it before that time, they are in violation of something. How much trouble they'll actually get in for that, obviously, your mileage will vary. But on this page, I wanted to highlight civil unrest. The retention schedule is until manually deleted, and I think that could be a use case of the body-worn camera that could have some very vague outlines. And so I would just note that that's a place where they could just be holding on to that video. Something else to highlight is what we are seeing as part of this marketing push around surveillance technology. So San Diego uses Axon 3 body-worn cameras. Axon is a company that makes a lot of body-worn cameras, but first they made the Taser, and they've since changed their name. They became Axon. They got very big into the body-worn camera industry market, and they have been trying to add new tools to their collection and new software capabilities to their collection. And they are moving into real-time crime centers and live access to video. So I want to highlight this company, Fusus, which is part of Axon, which I don't currently know is being used by San Diego, but I think you should be very aware of, because what we see with Axon, and increasingly with some of these other police companies, is that if you buy one of their products, they really want you to buy the rest of the ecosystem. They are really moving to try to bundle as much as they can and get police departments to depend on their particular products. And my colleague has heard this referred to at another one of the IACP conferences as sort of the Amazonification of police surveillance. And so I would just I really want to just keep in mind that because they use the Axon body cameras, almost certainly their Axon rep is trying to get them to use some of their other tools, including Fusus. Fusus does a couple of things. It both can integrate into one system a lot of the data that they're getting from a lot of these other surveillance tools, including license plate readers, which I'll talk about, drones, gunshot detection, whatever their data streams are for surveillance tools. Fusus really wants police departments to be looking at it on one screen, and that screen they want to be a Fusus screen. Fusus also makes it much easier for law enforcement to integrate cameras from a lot of different sources, including cameras owned by the city or jurisdiction itself, as well as private cameras. And there has been a push across a lot of different cities to connect that city to Fusus so that law enforcement can have real-time access to their video camera feeds. Law enforcement will say that this is going to save them a lot of money. It means that they don't have to knock on doors and that people get to set the permissions so that if they don't want law enforcement to have live access, they don't have to allow it. However, we see a lot of police departments using obviously their own personnel to try to push the use of Fusus. We've seen cities try to integrate or try to demand that Fusus be used by particular businesses before they can get certain permits. We've seen a lot of a push to try to pressure the public into integrating their cameras. And this can include Ring cameras, it can be business cameras, grocery store cameras, and we don't often have a really good way of understanding whose cameras, where those cameras are, unless they are sort of city-owned cameras, at which point, we can kind of figure out through public records requests or through other sort of press releases sometimes that they have connected, for example, bus stop cameras or whatever it may be. So again, I have not seen that this is being used in San Diego, but since they are already an Axon customer, it's something that I would watch out for. Okay, so the next technology I want to talk about, drones. We're seeing a ton of drones being adopted right now. Obviously, there are certain situations that law enforcement is going to say require drones because they're just too dangerous to send a person into. But obviously, we've also seen that drones get used to surveil large gatherings. They get used for like random things like building compliance and fires. Fires I can kind of understand, but increasingly what we're seeing is the drone as first responder program. And Chula Vista, your neighbor, has really been at the forefront of pushing this. It's the idea that when a call comes in, a drone should be sent as a first responder because it can give situational awareness to law enforcement before they get there. We know that in Chula Vista, basically the entire city is within range of one of these drones. And we have seen, because they have some transparency portal that gives the public access to the use of these drones, that a lot of them tend to be responding to things like disturbances or vandalism, as opposed to some of the other ways that they initially had justified it. And here I have a clip from San Diego's surveillance use policy report for drones. And I want to highlight just that as they're talking about the impact that this could possibly have on neighborhoods, they say that it must be initiated by, a particular commander in response to a specific event. And sometimes, I think for the layperson that might sound like a good thing, right? They're only going to use it if there's a reason. But again, as we're seeing more of these drones as first responder programs get adopted, as a lot of this technology gets adopted by neighboring cities. I think it's worth pointing out that sometimes that specific incident could be almost any incident that law enforcement thinks that they have to respond to. Drones obviously fly over a lot of areas that law enforcement would never have access to. It is recording, and it's important to keep in mind that a lot can be seen from the sky. So, drones. Automated license plate readers. I'm going to start talking a little bit more quickly because I want to make sure that we are able to get to everything and then get to questions. Automated license plate readers are widely used. The basic idea is that if a particular police department is looking for a particular vehicle, they can put that vehicle's license plate on a hot list. And then if that vehicle goes by a license plate reader within their jurisdiction or within another jurisdiction that maybe uses the same kind of license plate reader, they will receive a real-time alert saying your target vehicle has been identified. This all depends on a ton of information being siphoned up about everybody's travel patterns when it comes to their vehicles. And so depending on whether or not there's this retention schedule around that information, police can track historical travel patterns. They can often search by location for vehicles that were within a particular area. They can do network mapping where they can try to identify and increasingly use AI to identify vehicles that might be near each other or have been near each other. Sometimes they can provide sort of predictions on where a particular vehicle might be at any given time. And again, this is data that is widely shared, sometimes in a way that law enforcement doesn't understand because they don't understand sort of how some of these databases work. We've also seen that law enforcement is sometimes directed to just grid a neighborhood, which means that like if they don't have anything else to do, they'll just drive up and down collecting people's license plates. Errors with license plate readers are not uncommon. We've seen a few really terrible instances, but I also personally know people who have been pulled over because of license plate readers that read their license plate wrong. This is one horrible situation from Aurora, Colorado, where a family's minivan was misidentified as a stolen motorcycle, and you can see that they pulled the whole family out of the car so that they could try to arrest them. This family was able to sue and ultimately settle, but really shouldn't have happened at all. And then I also want to highlight with license plate readers, like with a lot of these other mass data collection systems, it's very bad if bad actors get into them. This is a lot of information that they would not have otherwise had. But when there is a data breach of these systems, that is information that could easily be used against people. Another tool, and San Francisco definitely uses ALPR. I mean, San Diego definitely uses license plate readers. Face recognition. I don't believe that this is currently being used in San Diego. I think a couple of years ago, San Diego cut off in 2020, they cut off the program that they had been using, and then there had been a statewide moratorium on the use of face recognition, but I think it's something to look out for, especially because there is so much data sharing going on. And something that we see is that even in locations where there has been a local ordinance banning face recognition, sometimes what local law enforcement will do is they will go to one of their neighboring agencies or to a federal agency and just ask that agency to run the photo. There are a couple types of face recognition. Some compare, a photo to a known set of photos and just tries to make sure that those faces match up. And then sometimes it connects to a whole database of photos and just sort of pulls likely matches. The program that San Diego had been using, Clearview AI, actually, I think they've been using a few different programs, but Clearview claims to have billions and billions of photos that they've basically scraped from all over the web and other public resources, photos that, and can identify you in photos that you didn't realize you were in. Obviously, face recognition makes mistakes, terrible, terrible mistakes. It is maybe the only technology right now that Electronic Frontier Foundation believes should just be banned outright from government use. And it's not really supposed to be used on its own as a lead, but we see law enforcement do that all the time, and that that leads to some of these wrongful arrests and jail time and just terrible consequences. The idea of being accused of a crime you didn't commit because a computer said that that was you is horrifying. Gunshot detection. Gunshot detection essentially works based on triangulation of microphones, like in the case of ShotSpotter. ShotSpotter was used in San Diego, but I believe it's no longer being used. It had only been used in I want to say it's District 4 in these few neighborhoods. And an analysis, according to this report, of the times that officers responded to a ShotSpotter detection. Only 62 of them were actually ended up being confirmed as gun-related crime. There have been other reports from other parts of the country, including New York City, that have found that the accuracy rate on ShotSpotter is incredibly low. ShotSpotter would claim that they are 97% accurate. I believe the New York City report found that they were inaccurate 85% of the time. One of the huge issues, and some of you might have experience with this, is that law enforcement is going to respond to a crime that they think involves a gun much differently. These microphones are put into particular areas, and so you can imagine just the repeat trauma of having law enforcement just blazing into your neighborhood, thinking that a gun has gone off or acting like a gun has gone off when it hasn't. And they're only going to get notifications from your neighborhood because that's the neighborhood where the microphones are. Cell site simulators, we currently are a little unclear on where these stand because we know that they're still being used, but the companies that provide them have shifted and some of them have stopped selling them. And we also think that law enforcement is maybe shifting their cell phone surveillance to other methods. But you should know, because we have seen this in the past, cell site simulators are tools that basically spoof cell phone towers so that any cell phone within range that's trying to connect to a cell phone tower will just connect to this device, and then the device is able, depending on what kind it is, sometimes it's able to get just the metadata, not just the metadata, but get the metadata. Sometimes it's able to get the content of the actual communications. Metadata meaning sort of when you called somebody, what the number you were calling, the duration of the call, that sort of thing. But other times it can intercept the actual content of the call. These can be incredibly small devices, but again, I want to talk more about another form of cell phone surveillance that we know is happening because we have sort of lost how they're getting access to these technologies. Cell site simulators have been some of the most, the technologies that police are most secretive about. They would rather throw out a case in a lot of instances than admit that was how they got some of the evidence that they did. And this was a case where, they're using this incredibly invasive tool. They're siphoning up all of this information about people who are making phone calls and using their phone within a particular area. And, there was one particular case where they were using it because somebody had like stolen some chicken wings maybe, and they were using this incredibly invasive device. Real-time crime centers. So real-time crime centers are a growing way of law enforcement to try to make sense of all of these different data streams that they have. They sort of grew out of New York following 9/11, 2001. And we are seeing them everywhere. That Fusus system I was talking about earlier is really trying to bring more real-time crime centers to even smaller departments. And so this used to be a sort of system that was more limited to larger police departments, maybe like San Diego, who have more resources. But we're seeing this crop up in a lot of different places now, and it facilitates data sharing. These streams, these data centers, as you see here, historically have sort of been, walls of monitors with different cameras going and some of the other different feeds. But as more AI is being applied to these systems and technologies are shrinking, some of these real-time crime center capabilities are now accessible, as law enforcement is in the field, on much smaller devices. Similar to real-time crime centers are fusion centers. These are federal centers that are also trying to coordinate data sharing. And so San Diego does have one of these centers, where information from the federal level and from the state and from local law enforcement are sort of all being fed into a common center that they can be, where they can be looking at it. This is a report that was done 5-6 years ago now, out of St. Louis, looking at the ways that the Real-Time Crime Center was being used. And unsurprisingly, it was being used to try to address businesses, rather than people. And so I think, that's another thing that we see a lot of with the adoption of some of these AI technologies or smart technologies, is that there's often, as part of this public safety pitch, this idea that it's very important for our economic development for us to have this amount of surveillance. And I've definitely seen grants where cities make that pitch that if they could only have more surveillance, more businesses would come to their town, and everybody would be would benefit. Okay. Predictive policing. Predictive policing is like this terrible idea that has like been shot down and then reborn like multiple times in the last few years. What we've seen is that that name sort of shifts. It's this idea that you can use historical crime data to predict where new crimes are going to happen, or you can use data on individuals to predict whether or not they're going to commit another crime. Obviously, you cannot predict the future. Obviously, a lot of historic crime data coming out of terrible policing practices is only going to create terrible predictions or predictions that reinforce terrible policing practices. But nonetheless, we continue to see this idea come back. Sometimes it comes back in the form of data-driven policing, or crime forecasting, or whatever new term they're trying to use, but a lot of the idea is the same. And unfortunately right now, because of the way that some of the data analysis is shifting, and so much is happening through third parties, it's not totally clear the extent of the predictiveness in some of these systems, some of these software systems. Camera registries are basically these programs that allow people to tell law enforcement whether or not they have a camera, so that law enforcement, if they had a crime in a particular area, will know to go and ask those people for that footage. Fusus will say that they are sort of hosting a camera registry, which is this list. But increasingly, right, as part of this sort of registry, they would like people to sort of be buying in and just sharing that footage proactively, or proactively giving that permission, in part because law enforcement hates doing paperwork and to have to go get a warrant. is much for them. This is a screenshot of a page out of the San Diego County Sheriff's Office, where they are also basically trying to push these camera registries, but they also are offering a way for people to be sharing that information. I didn't see Fusus really mentioned as I was looking at this site, but I imagine it's a sort of a similar situation where if you give law enforcement permission to access your video feeds, depending on the permissions, they could just do that. And some of these systems, again, use Ring. Ring used to have a partnership with law enforcement where it was a lot easier for them to get access to people's Ring footage, but that system has since been shut down. Still, law enforcement can get access to Ring footage either through some of these other platforms that I've talked about or through the regular warrant process. And I just want to highlight that in a study from San Francisco, we saw that a lot of the Ring videos that claim to show suspicious behavior did not show suspicious behavior. It contained people of color. And something that we're very aware of and warn people about when it comes to some of these doorbell cameras is that it inspires suspicion of your neighbors, as well as providing these surveillance capabilities, which also include recording audio. And so I think that's also something to keep in mind. Okay. I'm going to pivot a little bit because we cover third-party investigative platforms in the Atlas of Surveillance. I'm not sure that San Diego is using this particular platform, but I really want to emphasize the problem that is data brokers. Data brokers are basically these entities that try to collect data from a ton of different sources, increasingly and predominantly right now, it seems like from our mobile phones, from apps. And that information gets used in a lot of different ways, and it's incredibly vulnerable, and it is wild that it is still legal to buy and sell as much information as they have on people, and law enforcement is really taking advantage of that, or the companies that sell things to law enforcement are really taking advantage of that. On the screen right now is a screenshot from a law enforcement presentation about Fog Reveal. Fog Data Science is a company that is basically a subsidiary of another big data broker company called Ventel. And Fog was designed specifically for law enforcement. And the idea, all of this is sort of based off of ad IDs. So as you travel through the internet, use your phone and whatnot, you've probably noticed, if you're not using ad blockers, that you go to one site and you go to another site, and now you're getting, you looked at sneakers and now you're getting ads for sneakers, and you looked at, whatever it was that you were shopping for. So all of that is dependent on the mobile advertising market, where there's constant bidding going on based on different criteria, show my ad to people who have previously looked at this item, or show my ad to people who live in this particular area. That information is, being derived from different permissions that we've given our apps. It's being derived from cookies, which are sort of these like tiny trackers that follow us around the internet as we move from website to website if we don't block them. And that information can also include location. Sometimes it includes location because it is vaguely identifying your location based on your proximity to a tower or to whatever tower you happen to be pinging with your mobile activity. Sometimes it's because you have given permission to an app that to follow your location. And unfortunately, the secondary data market is wildly unregulated. And so, we run into, it is very common, super common, maybe just the norm, that when you sign up for an app, you have to consent, even though the idea of consent being used is totally ridiculous. You have to consent to the terms of using the app. And sometimes those terms say, well, we can actually just use your data in whatever ways we want to for our business purposes. And sometimes that's just selling it, and often it's selling it to these data brokers. So these data brokers are collecting a ton of information. And in this particular portal or platform, law enforcement was able to identify, was able to do something called like geofencing. I also want to say, this is getting a little in the weeds, but some of the tricky ways that they're able to do this legally involve this mobile advertising ID. So in a lot of places, there's this idea that you can't buy and sell and trade our personally identifiable information, which would be things like our social security number. We have a mobile ad ID that generally is attached to our phone. It follows us around. It knows sort of what we're doing. And even though it doesn't have our name on it, it knows, that I keep my phone in the same place every night. Presumably that's going to be the place that I live. I go to certain places throughout the day, it's pretty easy to figure out, this little dot moves here in the morning and then moves back and then, goes to the grocery store, it goes to school, it goes to work, it goes to worship, it goes all over the place. And so sort of the wiggly thing that has happened is that some of these companies will say, well, we're not selling personally identifiable information. We are just sort of giving you the ability to see and track all of the little dots within an area of interest. And then you sort of have to use your reasoning to figure out who that is. And we got communications about fog reveal where, there's sort of like this obvious like wink, wink about the PII, and some of the police officers talking about this tool, right, is like, oh, well, but if we're good at our jobs, we can use this tool to identify people. And so just incredibly invasive, very secretive the way that it is being used, and totally dependent on this huge data broker market. In California, you do have the right to ask an app or a company or a data broker what information they have on you. And so if you're interested in doing that, you can put in a request under the California Consumer Privacy Act to ask companies what information they have on you. Data brokers are taking, and police companies are taking that information and applying artificial intelligence and a lot of other analysis to try to make law enforcement easier. And law enforcement is really loving it. And so these are a few companies that do some of this data broker work. They're not all necessarily doing some of this mobile location tracking, but they are collecting a ton of information. LexisNexis is a company, they have people on their staff, or their whole job is to go out there and find different data sets. This technology, Cobwebs, has been used to track protesters and other situations, and now they've recently been acquired by this company, Penlink, that also does sort of visualizations and analysis on different types of police data. And so what we're really seeing is this trend of law enforcement adopting what EFF calls third-party investigative platforms to get access to a ton of information, to make sense of all of the data that they're collecting in through their other types of surveillance, and to be trying to basically create some sort of profile on individuals. So LexisNexis really prides itself on its LexID, which it sort of connects to a ton of different data sources, right? It might be like, your addresses, your phone numbers, and then like this whole slew of other information coming from mobile phones and data brokers. I promise I am getting to the end of this, and then I'll be able to address some questions. But these are some questions that I just encourage people to keep in mind, ask as some of these technologies get adopted or used. What is that data being collected? Like, really, what is that data being collected? Is it video and audio, or is it something like biometrics? Are they recording your voice and then making voice prints off of it? Who actually gets to hold that data? I've seen situations where law enforcement is using a particular platform, and that platform actually in the fine print claims that even after the contract ends, they continue to own that data and they don't have to delete it. And increasingly, they want to do that because they want to be able to train some of their algorithms with fresh data collected from law enforcement. Again, how and where is that data being collected? The actual locations is important, right? Because we see a lot of surveillance go into neighborhoods that have already suffered at the hands of police. So why are they putting that data collection platform where they are putting it? How long is that data being stored, and when is it being deleted? Is there a retention period, and is there a justification for the retention period? If it's license plate reader data, are they keeping it for 3 days or 3 seconds? We do have some states that have limited ALPR data retention to basically 3 seconds. If that license plate isn't already on a hot list, just delete it. Who is the data being shared with? Is it other police departments? Is it federal agencies like ICE? Especially with law enforcement in California, we've seen that they don't understand that some of these platforms, some of their tools are feeding into a central database. And so when, for example, license plate readers, it depends on that central database of license plate scans coming in from all over the place. They don't understand that that's being shared with a lot of other agencies, just as it is being shared with them. So not only who is it explicitly being shared with, but also who might it be shared with through the platform of the technology that even that police department doesn't understand. What are going to be the effects on vulnerable communities? What are the defined purposes? I don't need to explain that one to all of you. What are the defined purposes for which the system may be accessed or searched? In San Diego, at least, this ordinance does require that there be reasons given for why they might be using certain technologies. But again, that can be incredibly vague, and often law enforcement will write that rationale in a very vague way. How do you measure the technology's effectiveness? Again, San Diego does have a requirement that law enforcement develop some sort of metric by which they're able to figure out whether a technology is effective. And so I would encourage you all to just keep an eye out on that for that part of their justifications. Who can access the system and data? What kind of training are they receiving? How often is the system being audited for misuse? And does the public get to know when law enforcement abuses this system? Have there been data breaches or unauthorized access from the company? And how much does this system actually cost? Okay, so a few mitigation measures. You could put in what we call community control over police surveillance ordinances or surveillance equipment regulation ordinances, similar to what San Diego has, which basically requires that there be some proposed policy, some privacy assessment that's done in advance of actually getting the technology, that policy receive approval from a governing body that includes a public meeting, and that there be a regular report about the use of those technologies. There have also been bans. So I think, in some cases it is valuable to just go straight ban. And individually, I would say, limit your data sharing. At EFF, we're always talking about how privacy is a team sport. So it's not only for you to protect your privacy, it's for your community. to protect your own information and to encourage them to protect their information. I strongly suggest that people use Signal because Signal features end-to-end encryption, and it is much better at that than some of the other platforms. I know that people have said, I use Telegram or WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, and some of those don't have end-to-end encryption on by default, or they are not as trustworthy, we find, as Signal. On your mobile phone, if you do not need to be sharing your location with a particular application, turn it off. EFF has resources on exactly how to do that, but typically you should be able to go into your settings, and then there might be a list of apps that you have on your phone, and you should be able to, stop sharing your location, or change sort of what pieces of information they're able to gather from you. On your computer, I would suggest you block cookies. And EFF offers a plugin called Privacy Badger that helps block some of these trackers. These measures are not going to be perfect, but if you can limit how much information you are just accidentally sharing with some of these data brokers, the better off you're going to be. And then with some of these data brokers and some of these third-party platforms, what we're really seeing is a very liberal use of the idea of open source information. And some of this open source information is information that is just taken from the dark web. And on the dark web, there is a lot of information that has been hacked or leaked. And that is part of why we really strongly encourage people to use strong passwords and two-factor authentication, and just make yourself not the low-hanging fruit. Because if you use the same password for many different applications and that ends up in a place where it is vulnerable and accessible to other people, not only are you going to end up in situations where you are getting incredibly specific scam calls or text messages, but you are also opening yourself up to law enforcement being able to access some of that also. So I strongly encourage people to just try to take some of these steps to limit what data is out there.